Okay, Bismillah ar-Rahman ar-Rahim. Assalamu alaikum and Eid Mubarak, everybody. We knew that because this is a holiday, we might not have too many people joining us. But here at Usuli, the work continues. We had a discussion about whether we should take a break, and it's like, we've been doing this for 20, 30 years, and I've joked a lot about how vacation is really not in our vocabulary. But it's blessed work, and so it's hard to imagine something else more important that you'd like to be doing, even though we often give up sleep and we often give up free time, and but I mean, alhamdulillah, I think everything that we're doing is so exciting and fulfilling for us that I mean, when I was asked my opinion, I was like, oh, we should continue doing it. Let me start by just reminding people of my friend Tahir. This is my friend that I introduced everyone to last halaqa. This is the Atlantic article on the Uyghur Muslims, and this is actually, you can find this online, and he shares a lengthy story about what it was like when he was losing friends day by day and things were changing in China, and how he and his family were able to get out, and how they really feel that they will never overcome the guilt of surviving. And this, as I had said before, was a very painful story that, I was carrying this around with me, and I actually ended up finishing reading it that night. And it was extremely painful for sure. But I think also it made you feel, he's a poet, and he shares his story. And you feel like you're just hearing a friend tell you a story. And you could very much imagine that this could happen to you, if you happen to be living in a country where things are repressive and you really have no control. And interestingly, he's 2 years younger than I am, which is striking, because I think if you look at this picture, it just shows that there's been obviously a lot of life experienced and a lot of pain experienced. But anyway, this is again in my sort of quest for asking and questioning myself whether I'm doing enough to change what is happening now with the Holocaust, in our midst. And I did send the link to one of my close Jewish friends, and had a conversation with her, because she actually had sent me a link before the last time they had Passover Seder, that they decided as a community that they were going to make the Uyghur Muslims the focus of their prayers, which I thought was amazing, because that would seem to be a little bit even more than Muslims were doing. But inshallah, may we continue, to do everything that we can with the situation in our midst. I wanted to just take a moment also too. I was sort of struck with, Sharif shared a comment with me earlier about, getting questioned about what it's like to be the son of a scholar. And this sort of dovetailed with, last night I was trying to do another Mito and Baba session, because it's been some time. Because since coming to Ohio, we've been just so incredibly busy that it's been really hard to keep up with just normal activities in life. And we didn't actually have an official Baba Mito session where it was recorded, which was very unlike me, because I record everything. But it turned out to be a very important conversation, because it was one of these Mito Baba sessions where actually, I think Mito got to learn a lot about what it's truly like to live the life of a scholar, because sometimes, when your kids are in your house, you don't really exactly know what's going on. You see your parents running back and forth, they're busy, they don't have time for, normal types of things. And it was a really amazing opportunity, I think, to even just hear from, me hearing as an outsider, like the stories of, and I'd heard some of these stories before, of what it was like for Sheikh to grow up and have the mindset that he has, which led us all to where we are today. And so I thought I would just share a little bit of that story, because it's fascinating, because not everyone obviously can be a scholar, and certainly not everyone can reach this point where we are and be able to give to all of us the incredible knowledge that we are experiencing. And and I hope you don't mind, I'm just sort of sharing some of these, interesting tidbits, but like, the Sheikh from the time he was young was very ill and unable to do very much as far as other kids were concerned. So he was, the kids that in school that, are not able to do sports. They're the last ones picked on sports teams, the ones that kids always sort of isolate as being different. He didn't have a lot of friends, and was spent a lot of his time just reading to entertain himself and to learn about the world. And he said that he very quickly realized that there was just so much knowledge in the world, and was determined to learn literally everything, from gravity to, you know, the way, you know, the sun and the moons, you know, I mean, just everything about life. And so when he started to read, as he learned more, he very quickly realized that there was just way too much for him to learn, and that he probably could not leave this planet without knowing more than maybe 1% of all knowledge that is out there. So he learned that he should learn what is actually meaningful. And he became very interested in God, because he very quickly realized that the life that we live here is not by coincidence, it's not by random chance, that, you know, the things that we experience are so miraculous that obviously there had to be a creator. And so he became very interested in studying to know more about God. And so part of his schooling and growing up was spent in secular schools from basically 8:30 in the morning until 2:30 in the afternoon. And then he would come home and rest, and then go to Islamic schools at night from, you know, the afternoon until probably 8 o'clock at night, and come home and eat dinner and do homework until 1, and then wake up and go to Fajr, come back and rest for a little bit, and go to school, and his day would begin again. And that was basically his entire childhood and, you know, and teenagehood. I mean, he really didn't have friends, he didn't spend time socializing, he didn't spend time doing the things that typical, you know, kids do. And certainly, you know, Mito hearing this story, Mito, who spends, you know, most of his time, you know, interacting with his friends online, playing video games, watching YouTube and these kinds of things, is a very different kind of perspective. And, you know, so it was a really beautiful, like, conversation, because it was such a different world that he grew up in. And, you know, obviously that he appreciated knowledge, and also noticed that when he was in high school, you know, all the kids that were into, you know, whether it was boyfriends and girlfriends, or looking cool, or, you know, having the latest, you know, luxury or whatever, that very soon those optics really meant very little. And that he was determined to sort of prove to these kids who didn't treat him nicely and who didn't want to pick him for their you know, sports teams or whatever, that he was going to be extremely successful and, you know, and achieve, and that he wanted to prove to the world. So that became its own motivation and its own habit, until it became part of him that no matter what he did, he wanted to do a good job and, you know, and succeed. And it's a really inspiring story, because, you know, it's like now, obviously, you know, 30, 40 years later, you go back and you can go to Facebook and you can see the friends you went to school with, and, you know, the cheerleaders and, you know, the people that were beautiful, and see like how their lives have turned out. And many of them have not done anything at all impressive. And so, you know, it just, there's so many stories to tell. And I think, you know, the interesting thing about, like, what Sharif had said was, someone had asked him what it was like to be the son of a scholar. And, you know, he said that's a really difficult question to answer, but what struck me about what he said is that growing up, he felt that he, you know, was learning an Islam that most people didn't know. And it wasn't until he got a lot older that he realized no one else knew this Islam. And that was also very similar to the way I would have answered the question, because people have asked me, what's it like to be the wife of a scholar, and especially as a convert, is that I feel like the Islam that I was exposed to was extremely different than the Islam that the vast majority of people know. And I think what's beautiful now is that people, this is exactly what we're learning in Project Illumine. And the other thing that was very beautiful that the Sheikh shared with Mito is that part of the sacrifice, I mean, there were definitely a lot of sacrifices in us coming here to focus on this project. And, you know, I think the Sheikh has said, you know, for a law professor to leave academia, or to even step aside for a little bit of time from academia to focus on something, you know, religious like the Quran, I mean, you know, everyone's going to look at you like you're absolutely insane. Like, why would you even do that? You know, you're walking away from a very prestigious, you know, situation. Even Muslim academics would look at you in the same way. But, you know, he said that it took some time for him to, you know, he for a long time felt like, well, all of this stuff with the Quran that, you know, other people obviously must know this. You know, I'm sure I'm not the only one that is understanding the things in this way. And it took a long time for him to come to the realization that, well, okay, if other people are understanding this the way that I'm understanding it, well, where are they? Why aren't they teaching it this way? Why aren't they talking about it this way? And it became, clear over time that no one else does understand it this way. And that this is something, I think when he tested it with a lot of, us, and me, the reaction was like, oh my God, no, this is something that is so special that needs to be shared. And it became a religious duty. And it's a hard thing to explain to people who are very tied to the material world, who don't believe that the Quran has anything to offer. But I think for some of us, I think it's very valuable. And I hope people, it's hard to truly understand the sacrifices that a scholar goes through. I mean, it's an entire lifetime worth of sacrifice, whether it's putting every bit of savings you have into buying books, or whether it's staying up late. I mean, we were supposed to have Eid prayer today, and the sheikh was in so much pain from all last night to this morning, up until literally the minute before we were going to start. He was still trying to fight his pain and wanted to even try and rest for a little bit longer to see if he could actually get up and give the Eid khutbah. And he pushed as long as he could till the very last minute, and finally it was actually Sharif that said, no, we have to know our limits, and you shouldn't push yourself like this. And then we decided to cancel. But that, just so people understand the level of dedication, people don't understand what it's like to live in pain 24/7. It's, if you ever have experienced pain even for a moment, like I know when I have a headache, it's like the world is over at that moment. But if you imagine your life living in severe pain 24/7 and learning to live with that, when you reach the level of pain that that you want to cancel, someone like Sheikh who has a very high pain tolerance, that's a really serious amount of pain. And he pushed past it to prepare all day today to be here for this halaqa. And so, just to let people understand the amount of sacrifice, the amount of dedication, the amount of, fighting pain in order to be here. And just, I hope that people, even if you don't see it, I try to witness this so that people understand what it takes, because it's such a lonely path, and it's such a thankless path. And people just, think that, oh, they have a free video, on YouTube, we'll just turn it on at our convenience. Oh, we're just irritated because it's 6 hours long or 4 hours long. If people understood the amount of time and energy and dedication and knowledge and everything that went into it from the time he was little, that, it's like the gift we're getting is priceless. There's just no words for it. So, this is an Eid gift for all of us that keeps on giving. And so thank you for everything. I hope you don't mind. He doesn't like to talk about himself, but for me, I have to witness. And just so people can appreciate what it takes to get this knowledge. So, alhamdulillah, and may Allah bless you, and may Allah, help all of us appreciate, everything that goes into it. And I'm really excited and looking forward to another incredible session. So, assalamu alaikum.
بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم الحمد لله رب العالمين والصلاة والسلام على محمد وعلى آله وأصحابه واتبعوا بإحسان إلى يوم الدين اللهم اشرح لي صدري ويسر لي أمري واحلل عقدة من لساني يفقهوا قولي يا رب. I prepared the Eid khutbah. Unfortunately, I thought it was a good khutbah, but I'm not going to end up giving it. Alhamdulillah. So inshallah today, I'm not sure, the surah that we are inshallah covering is Surah Ghashiyah. But depending on how things go, we might end up covering more than Ghashiyah. I thought if I managed to cover Ghashiyah in a relatively short time, then maybe I can do Surah Al-A'la as well. Which, in the way that the Quran is organized, is, of course, the surah that comes right after Ghashiyah, although they were revealed at two different times. But let's see how it goes. So Ghashiyah is from the mid-Meccan period. It was revealed after Surah Al-Dhariyat. Although stylistically it would look like a very early surah. Stylistically, one would have thought it would be revealed early on in the Meccan period, but all the vast majority of sources say that it was revealed mid-Meccan. Most sources say it was revealed after the Dhariyat and right before Surah Al-Kahf. Now, of course, Surah Al-Kahf, which we have not covered, Surah Al-Kahf and Surah Al-Nahl and Surah Ibrahim, Surah Al-Anbiya, these surah in many ways complement one another, and they are all part of a paradigm shift in but Surah Al-Ghashiyah is like a lot of the very early Meccan surahs, although as we said it is from the mid-Meccan period. It underscores the very concept of accountability, like a lot of the very early surah. They came anchored around the oneness of God, to address specifically and clearly the concept of accountability, that without accountability, then in the entire creation is pointless. And that in fact, without accountability, the very idea of God itself becomes very problematic. This is a philosophical / theological issue, but because it was well known at the time that Islam came to, that the Prophet Muhammad ﷺ came with his message, the idea that there is a God, but that this God does not necessarily have a system of accountability in which people are necessarily held to answer for their deeds. And what the philosophical / theological issue is that would contravene the very concept of God's justice. Because a God that would create and allow whatever unfolds on this earth to unfold without there being further consequences to anything is necessarily an unjust God. The idea of a just God becomes only possible with accountability, that there is something beyond this life. Of course, in Judaism especially, there emerged the idea that, well, you sort of, if you do good deeds, God allows you to benefit from your good deeds on this earth, and if you do bad deeds, then God punishes you for these bad deeds on this earth. But that becomes very empirically difficult to justify, because there are plenty of people who that's not the way it works out for them in this life. That good deeds or bad deeds are not answered in this earth, and among many other issues. So the first stage of revelation often did precisely that it underscored that there's only one God, and that the idea of some type of division of labor among divinities is an absurd proposition, and that accountability is core to the faith. And so Surah Al-Ghashiyah on the one hand seems to do precisely that, plus a further element that is characteristic of the mid-Meccan period onwards. Oh, is Joe traveling?
Yeah.
Where is he now? Jordan?
I think he's on his way there, or he just got there.
Plus, an element that is rather characteristics from the mid-Meccan revelation onwards, and that is to emphasize that the Prophet ﷺ is nothing but a reminder, and that the Prophet doesn't control. The Prophet doesn't control the fate of people, and that is not part of his mission. And that is something that is characteristics of the mid-Meccan period onwards, with some issues that we'll see that come up in Surah Al-Ghashiyah. Okay. So in most Quranic translations and most traditional tafsir, Surah Al-Ghashiyah sounds fairly straightforward, in that it starts out by saying, هل أتاك حديث الغاشية, which of course is a rhetorical device where you as a rhetorical device you raise it in a form of a question to underscore the importance of an event. And have you heard of Al-Ghashiyah? Now we know that the hereafter, or the final day, is referred to in the Quran in several ways, as Al-Ghashiyah, as Al-Halaqa, as Al-Dhariyah, all which in the traditional tafsir are taken to refer to basically the same set of events, and that is the end of life on this earth and the beginning of the next stage. And so, have you heard about the coming of Al-Ghashiyah, or have you heard about the unfolding of Al-Ghashiyah? And Ghashiyah quite literally means an event that overwhelms, an event that overcomes or overwhelms, or something that is of an overwhelming power and an overwhelming force that reshapes things. So, have you heard of that event? Now, why do we say, well, it refers to the the hereafter specifically because of what comes first. And I'm sorry, because of what comes after. هل أتاك حديث الغاشية وجوه يومئذ خاشعة عاملة ناصبة. So on that day, the day where you see faces, khashia means humbled, humbled, downtrodden. It could even mean stressed, burdened, and amilatun nasiba. Now, amilatun nasiba, which literally would be, nasiba is something that's weary or attentively anxious. Amila means toilsome or toiling, hard at work. تصلى نارا حامية. Here it's where the picture becomes clearer that we're talking in fact about the hereafter. تصلى نارا حامية, entering a scorching fire. تسقى من عين آنية. العين الآنية is a bubbling or boiling either water spring or water source. So scorching fire, boiling water. ليس لهم طعام إلا من ضريع. الضريع, it was a type of plant known at the time that the Quran was revealed. When this plant first grows, when it's still green, it's called the shabrak, and it is eaten by animals. When it dries up, animals stop eating it. It becomes thorny and poisonous, and then it becomes called a dariya. The same plant goes from being a shabrak to a dariya. So let's say ليس لهم طعام إلا من ضريع. So that indicates that whatever food is available, it is something poisonous, something at a minimum extremely unpleasant to eat. لا يسمن ولا يغني من جوع, that even as unpleasant as it is, it doesn't satisfy any hunger. This, what in traditional tafsir is often seems like a very straightforward reference to a burning fire, a boiling water, and a unpleasant, horrible food that doesn't satisfy, and so on. In traditional tafsir, it's all of plain meaning and without much to do about it. So, and that's the opening salvo of Surah Al-Ghashiyah. But as especially in many of the Sufi-esque tafsir, they looked at Hadith al-Ghashiyah, and as often when the if the word can have a double meaning, if a word like al-Ghashiyah, which literally means an event that's overwhelming, then Sufi as-Tafsir tended to look at it and say, well, why limit it to events that unfold only in the hereafter? If Allah wanted to say, make a reference only exclusively to the hereafter, then Allah would have said so. But the fact that Allah uses a word like al-Ghashiyah, and the day of overwhelming events, then they take that as an invitation from Allah to reflect upon the hereafter and any parallel set of situations that can be described also under the rubric of al-Ghashiyah. And methodologically that makes sense, because when the Quran wants to use language that is non-negotiable, not expansive, it does so, while the meaning, when words are used that could have layers of meaning, in various methodologies of tafsir, that was considered to be intentional and purposeful. Okay. So, what else could al-Ghashiyah refer to? And especially that it says, هَلْ أَتَاكَ حَدِيثُ الْغَاشِيَةِ. Did the news or did the knowledge of al-Ghashiyah come to you? And they thought that, especially when the Quran uses this grammatically, this reference to, in our modern language, what we would call to an epistemology that is used by human beings, that is employed by human beings, that is an indication of a more expansive meaning. So, هل أتاك حديث الغاشية? It's like saying, did the discourse about al-Ghashiyah reach you? And from that, they thought, well, then the discourse about al-Ghashiyah, it's like permission, or it's like an indication for an actual discourse about any event that can fall under the rubric of al-Ghashiyah. And most Sufi-esque tafsir looked at al-Ghashiyah as a reference to earthly life itself. So al-Ghashiyah, this overwhelming thing, is not just the hereafter, Yawm al-Qiyamah, but it's actually life on earth that could be so overwhelming وجوه يومئذ خاشعة was often read as if you handle the dunya in a certain way, then that would apply to you, that you would be as if, it's an idiomatic expression like as if dishonored faces that become dishonored by the way that they handle dunya, by the way they handle earthly life. So, what is the handling of dunya that can lead to amila nasiba? That can lead to tasla naran hamiya? Well, first, that if you do not understand the nature of a ghashiyah, whether this ghashiyah is life, is the anything that is ghashiyah, meaning anything that is overwhelming, whether it occurs into our temporal life or it occurs in the hereafter. If you fail to understand that something is only a ghashiyah because you lose sight of God's role in it, it's like losing sight that let's take the example that right now seems very relevant to me. You're in pain. You're in excruciating pain. If you lose sight of the fact that there is a God that wills that pain for you and that can take this pain away from you, and that ultimately will reward you for what you do with this pain, how you handle this pain, then that pain becomes a ghashiyah. It becomes overwhelming because it seems like it's just pain. No reason for it, no consequences to it other than the agony that you feel, and you are powerless before it. You can't do much with it. And because of that, what would apply to you is, it's like saying, well, because of the way that you've handled this ghashiyah, this overwhelming pain, now your face has become wujuh khasha. Your face has become like dishonored, solemn faces. You are distressed. You are burdened and distressed and sad. Amilatun nasiba, meaning here, you toil, meaning you work really hard with nervous energy, but pointless actions. What happens when we are confronted with overwhelming things? We become, yes, it's possible that you just cower and you put your head in a hole in the ground, right? It's possible. But what often happens is that you start getting nervous energy. You are busy. You are moving back and forth, like pacing back and forth. But entirely pointlessly. And entirely without point or purpose. All that energy avails you nothing. It takes you nowhere. And it is, in fact, the very handling, or rather mishandling, of what overwhelms you is what makes it, or what turns it into an unbearable fire. تصلى نارا حامية. So the same events, the same dunya, the same tests in dunya don't need to be an unceasing fire, but it is your mishandling of these events, i.e. your inability to understand the events for what they are. The example of the pain. So you're in agonizing pain, you do what a lot of people do, and you start thinking that it's the end of the world. I can't work, I can't think, I can't talk, you start snapping at people, you can't stand anyone, and you start looking for a way to relieve the pain, even if it's taking drugs or whatever, because you just want the pain to stop. That mishandling of a thing is what turns it into an unceasing fire. Now, they come to تسقى من عين آنية and ليس لهم طعام من ضريع. That what turns what you drink, or figuratively what you drink, into a source of agony and pain, and what you consume into further sinking into agony and pain. Well, in the language that you often encounter, شبهات الدنيا وحرماتها يزداد الجوع إليها وما يغني طعامها. That the irony about dunya is that as your nervous energy, the عاملة ناصبة, as you work nervously to handle the overwhelming events. But the irony of it is that the more you take from dunya to try to deal with what overwhelms you, the more you, as they say in Arabic poetry, داويني بالتي هي كانت الداء, that as the more you covet of dunya to try to address the pain that you are enduring, the worse your pain gets. So the natural tendency is that when people are overwhelmed in dunya, they think that, well, if I drink more, if I consume more, I'll be okay. If I get more from dunya, it will fix me. I'll be okay. I'll address Ghashiyah. But indeed, it never happens that way. And the more that you covet and the more that you consume, the worse you become. There is within the Sufi-esque approaches, there is a variation on this theme. And some, like Al-Qashani and or Ibn Arabi, Allahu Alam, whoever wrote that tafsir. But Ibn Arabi says the same thing in Futuhat anyway, so and that is, he has a very interesting sort of dual approach to the whole يسقى من عين آنية ليس لهم طعام إلا من ضريع لا يسمن ولا يغني من جوع. Is that he doesn't, they don't, or that orientation doesn't just see it as the problem is as you consume more. The problem is, in other words, it's not a problem of consumption. It's not just a problem of material things that are consumed that in fact make the Ghashiyah worse and worse. But rather, it is the type of ulum that you seek out, the type of knowledge that you seek out to address the predicament of al-Ghashiyah. And the reason I say it's a duality is that in this perspective, in fact, the punishment in the hereafter, in Ibn Arabi type thought and those who follow this orientation, is that fire in the hereafter is not like fire on earth. And boiling water in the hereafter is not like boiling water on earth. That in the hereafter, when Allah says عين آنية or ليس لهم طعام إلا من ضريع لا يسمن ولا يغني من جوع, Allah is alerting you to the fact that, I want to see if I okay, so first let me step back in a second. So first, in this approach, when Allah says عاملة ناصبة, burdened and toiling, right? So what type of toiling is engaged in? And the answer is أعمال شاقة من جنس أعمالها التي ضرب بها في الدنيا. That as to the hereafter, when Allah is talking to you, telling you, you will be toiling, He says you will be toiling, but this time you are toiling, repeating, or in you are toiling in actions or activity that is related to what you've done, your evil deeds on earth. So in other words, you will be toiling, but the toiling is not just any toiling. It is toiling that you are forced to do to address all the bad that you've done on earth. Now, so the next step. So when Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala then says, Tasla naran hamiya, in that orientation, they understand Tasla naran hamiya is that no fire is worse than the fire of ignorance and loss and the realization that you are to see the truth of who you are and what you've done, and that you are going to have to address what you've done. So تسقى من عين آنية. So they read this as العين الآنية من الجهل المركب الذي هو مشربهم والاعتقاد الفاسد المؤذي. So in the hereafter, when Allah refers to boiling water, it is the painful being forced to drink the water of your own ignorance. So it is like confronting your darkness. So then we come to Dariya, the food, right? So here, what is referred to ليس لهم طعام إلا من ضريع لا يسمن ولا يغني من جوع. This is understood as what you are in fact, because they don't believe in the hereafter that there is eating or drinking as we do on this earth. That this becomes but what you are forced to consume is, as the Arabic goes, شوك الخواطر القالبية الردية لصاحبها باتباع الهوى. That what you are forced to consume is the truthful, painful reality of the darkness of your intellect and heart. So if they understand, so it has a meaning in the hereafter as the ignorance of that you've lived in, confronting the stark truth of all the things that you got away with on earth. Because on earth you can delude yourself. You can say, I'm not really a horrible person. The people I hate deserve to be hated. I'm not really a horrible person. The people I hurt deserve to be hurt. But in the hereafter, all of that is taken away and you see things for their stark truth. And the fact that you are away from Allah and away from the realm of the light, and you don't realize it now, but in the hereafter, the ethereal being that you are is thoroughly in agony when it confronts these ethereal realities. And that becomes its true fire, because ignorance tears it apart in the same way that light and knowledge consolidates it together. So you're not torn apart by necessarily fire that has a certain temperature, but ignorance itself is a fire that literally rips you apart. In al-Futuhat, Ibn Arabi, in the tafsir attributed to Ibn Arabi that survived, he says it presents it a matter of linguistic interpretation. But in Futuhat, Ibn Arabi says that he presents it as a matter of visions that he's had. And a lot of other Sufis followed in, or even before Ibn Arabi, because you find some of this imagery even before Ibn Arabi. But okay, so what is the dual meaning that I'm referring to then? Is that on this earth, we said for the Sufi-esque orientation, Al-Ghashiyah on this earth is any overwhelming set of events in which you don't understand the divine properly. So what is it that you are drinking and what is it that you are eating? It is not your obsession with material consumption, but it is your addiction to wrong thinking. So طعام من ضريع in that orientation is العلوم الغير منتفع بها المؤذية. is ways of thinking that are not constructive and in fact harmful. So it is Allah alerting you by referring to Ghashiyah first that, listen, if you get a Ghashiyah in your life that overwhelms you and you don't have the proper perspective, in terms of life on this earth, you will be torn apart by your harmful emotions and harmful ideas. And in the hereafter, these harmful emotions and harmful ideas, when you see the truth of their darkness, they will become fire, as if fire tearing you apart, ripping you apart. In the other Sufi-esque interpretation, they basically say that when it refers to Ainun Aniya and Ta'amun Dariya, is that it's saying you'll try to solve your problems by consuming, and consuming will avail you nothing. It will, you will escape from your pain by coveting more of what material life has to offer, but what you covet, in fact, will be the source of your torment. Now, in contrast to that are the wujuh al-na'ima. The faces, this is wujuh al-na'ima, is verse 8. The faces that are in repose and in comfort. في جنة لسعيها راضية contented by its endeavors. في جنة عالية, in a high garden or high Jannah. لا تسمع فيها لاغية فيها عين جارية فيها سرر مرفوعة وأكواب موضوعة ونمارق مصفوفة وزرابي مبثوثة. So, a high garden where لا تسمع فيها لاغية, and just keep that in mind, that it hears no idle talk. There are flowing springs, there are raised couches, goblets placed, and cushions arrayed, and carpets spread. So this is all very literal, traditional translation. Okay. So, in the traditional tafsir, this is very straightforward. In the hereafter, there will be material comforts, and the material comforts will be carpets, cushions, goblets, meaning you drink all types of tasty stuff and eat all types of tasty stuff. In the Sufi-esque tradition, في جنة عالية, they point that Jannah is any blessed or any blissful state that Jannah al-Aliyah, any state of bliss is a Jannah. Any winning state is a Jannah. They come to لا تسمع فيها لاغية, and in traditional tafsir they say basically that no one speaks ill of anyone else in heaven. All people, their hearts are reconciled with one another. There's no hate, there's no enmity, there is no jealousy, there is no rancor, and so on. There is an interesting point, and that is, well, if people in Jannah have no hate, have no rancor, have no jealousy, then are they still themselves? Because hate, rancor, jealousy are all a part of free will. If you take free will away, are humans human anymore? Precisely because of this, at least the tafsir that were written by more of a rationalist orientation tended to pause at لا تسمع فيها لاغية, and have extended discussion as to and the gist of it was لا تسمع فيها لاغية. They insisted it's not that you don't, it's not as traditional tafsir say that you don't hear gossip or whatnot, but rather that there are no deceptions of power and authority, that deceptive ideas are not circulated from sources that would have the power to circulate these deceptive ideas. In other words, you live in a world of honesty. The Sufi-esque tafsir, however, come to لا تسمع فيها لاغية and say that what Allah takes away is the ability of the self to deceive the self. That once you take shaitan out of the equation and you take the demonic out of the equation, it's not that you're taking free will away, but whatever human beings feel that is not healthy, it becomes very superficial and quickly addressed, because the communities of counsel, if you will, that exist are angelic. And so you are quickly confronted by whatever wrong you might be, and the types of things that churn people up and that make people increase in spite, like the scarcity of things, or like competition, or like, it doesn't exist. Plus shaitan doesn't have a role in there. But anyway, further, there's another point. So لا تسمع فيها. So فيها عين جارية. What is this عين الجارية in the Sufi-esque tradition? They say it is the عين of الحكمة والمعرفة من عيون علوم المعارف والذوق والوجدان. So what this means is that the Ayn Dajariya here is this fountain. It's literally like saying the fountain of knowledge or the spring of knowledge. It is that the attainment of luminous truth that elevates and that cleanses. والسرر المرفوعة. In the traditional tafsir, as-surur al-marfu'a are, as we said, high couches. Now, the Sufi-esque tafsir has sort of it's a little bit of sarcasm that they'll often include, and but you need to know the literature well to catch that sarcasm. And it has to do with hadith. The hadith reportedly says that when this was revealed, Muslims went to the Prophet ﷺ and said, but Prophet, if the couches are going to be surur marfu'a, high couches, how are we going to sit on them? They're very high. And the Prophet reportedly says, well, in the year after, when you want to sit on them, the couch will sort of squitch itself down so that you can climb up, and then it will puff itself up again. So in Sufi, and they know that these traditions are not very reliable, so but then they sort of include these traditions and say, unless you are going to be among those who want to ride the what would translate as the seesaw couches, or the what is that? What do you call these things? Like in Magic Mountain.
Oh yeah.
Roller coaster.
Like equivalent like roller coaster couches. That and of course what they're saying is that this is they're sort of zinging the traditional tafsir without saying it right out. So they read Surah Marfu'a and وأكواب موضوعة ونمارق مصروفة. So these three, because I think it's best to explain them all at once, is that they say whether on this earth or whether in the hereafter, the way you handle a Ghashiyah on this earth, there are always stages of elevation. The stages of elevation are intimately interconnected with the extent to which you have internalized as-sifat al-ilahiyya, the divine attributes. The more you have internalized as-sifat al-ilahiyya, the higher the attainment in dealing with al-Ghashiyah. So, let's say, just hypothetically, let's say you have worked really hard on 10 of the Sifat al-Ilahiyya, and you have mastered these 10. So, and let's say, arguably, just for sake of argument, that you are latif, you have become a very kind human being, you have become wadud, you've become a very loving human being, sabur, you become a very patient human being, and so on. Well, that means the way you deal with al-Ghashiyah will be at a certain stage that is much higher than someone who has not attained any of the attributes. But someone who has attained 20 of the attributes rather than 10, the way they deal with al-Ghashiyah will be even higher. But they see the same thing as taking place in the hereafter. In the hereafter, your ability, what elevates you, what brings you true pleasure, true happiness, is truth, and the truth is Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. But the more you have attained, the more you have attained in the hereafter of the divine attributes, the higher your ability to be elevated by the truth. So, مراتب الصفات فإن لكل صفة من ابتداء تجليها وطوالع أنوارها وكونها حالا إلى كمال الاتصاف بها، فإذا استوفى السالك حظه منها بحسب استعداده وبلغ غاية مبلغه حتى تم سيره فيها وصارت ملكا له، كان مقامه منها نمرقة على تلك الأريكة التي هي موضع تلك الوصف مع الذات. So, but the fascinating thing is that they don't, it's like you attain a certain, you attain whatever you attain on this earth, and then you die, and then you're resurrected with what you've attained. But that's not the end of your journey. In the hereafter, you will continue to work to attain a higher and higher status. So some people in the hereafter will work very hard, but to do that you need your free will. You see, that's why the issue of free will mattered a lot for the Sufis and mattered a lot for the rationalists, but for very different reasons. The Sufis wanted to say that you will have the ability to continue working and to in fact rise, to grow in attainment of the divine in the hereafter. It depends on you. And they even say some people will attain whatever they want to attain in 100,000 years. Some people it will take them 10,000 years. Some people will take them whatever. So people will attain at different levels, and some people might not want to. I mean, they ultimately they're satisfied with whatever status they're in, and that's where they want to be and stop. So the way that they understand أكواب موضوعة ونمارق مصفوفة وضرابي مبثوثة is as illusions. So the أكواب, for instance, are illusions to أوصاف الذوات, that they're illusions to the moral or ethical characteristics. The thematic, as I said, are levels of attainment, while the dharabi Did I write the language? No. والذرابي المبثوثة is I didn't write the language of exactly the equivalent to الضرابي, but there's the ethical course, there's a what on the spot. I don't remember exactly, but it is not just extended carpets as in traditional tafsir, but it is an allusion again to some type of moral level, that or the leveling of morality. Okay. So then, this takes us to that point of Surah Al-Ghashiyah where Allah says, reflect. And this is, the transition takes place at 17. أَفَلَا يَنْظُرُونَ إِلَى الْإِبِلِ كَيْفَ خُلِقَتْ. So, أَفَلَا يَنْظُرُونَ إِلَى الْإِبِلِ كَيْفَ خُلِقَتْ. The traditional tafsir, again, this is fairly straightforward. Don't they look at how camels were created? And camels, of course, for Arabs, pre-Islamic Arabs, it mattered a great deal. Camels were, the miracle of the desert. There is another meaning to al-ibl. Not a lot of tafsir adopted that meaning, but it's plausible. Ibl could also be clouds that are heavy with water, that are laden with precipitation. So Allah could be saying, look at the camels, how they've been created, or look at the clouds of the clouds that carry water in rain. And then after al-ibl is as-sama, the heavens, how it's been raised, and al-jibal, mountains, and how they've been constructed as compared to the flat earth. So this would be up to verse 20. Or alternatively, it could be to clouds, to the heavens, to the mountains, to the flat earth. So don't you reflect upon the nature in these senses. In Sufi-esque tafsir, what is fascinating is that al-ibl could also mean any being without the intellect could be an ibl. And so Sufi-esque tafsir, they've often read al-ibl kayfa khuliqat as a reference to the raw material of an-nafs, human consciousness, without the intellect and without the soul. So it's like saying, don't you look at, or don't you reflect upon consciousness itself. And then they say, remember in the Sufi tradition, any reference to sama is always understood as a reference to the human spirit or human soul. So they, وَالسَّمَاءِ كَيْفَ رُفِعَتْ. أَرْوَاحُ السَّمَاء كَيْفَ رُفِعَتْ. That they understand that as how consciousness has been coupled with an active soul, the secret of which no one understands. الجبال كيف نصبت, the construction, the الجبل could also be the power source of anything. And from jibilla, from the word jibilla, or jablu shay. And so they understand that most often as qulub, as the hearts. Or as, or more, or as common as the uqul, as the intellects. The hearts or intellects. And al-ard كيف نصبت, they'll often read that metaphorically as referring to the body. So we say that Allah is saying, reflect upon consciousness, the spirit that animates this consciousness. وجبال العقل لتمييز الحس عن المعنى, and the intellects that are able to move mere sensation to actual meaning within the context of a body. Now, this reflection is for Allah to say, فذكر ما أنت إلا مذكر لست عليهم بمسيطر. To say, for Allah to tell the Prophet عليه الصلاة والسلام, remind people, because your role is to remind people, not to control people. Couple of things. Traditional tafsir see this as talking to the Prophet. Most of them, Allah is telling the Prophet, remind people, your role is to remind people, you don't control people. In more rational or rationally oriented or philosophically oriented tafsir, as well as Sufi tafsir, they see this as directed to anyone that is performing the role that the Prophet performed of advancing a moral cause. Your job is to remind, not to control. In traditional tafsir, they typically have a discussion that goes into, a lot of traditional tafsir say that this was abrogated after the revelation of jihad. Now, of course, as Al-Razi and many others say, the argument that this is abrogated by jihad is very myopic. We will get to this inshallah, but jihad was, or military conflict, was necessitated by a set of circumstances, most specifically when your enemy is ready to use force against you, whenever your enemy pleases, and sometimes it becomes necessary to preemptively communicate to your enemy, and this is what empires do all the time, that using violence against you will be extremely costly. But that never changes the role of a polity is one thing, but that never changes the basic ethical rule that the only way of advancing morality is to teach morality. Coercion doesn't establish morality. And in fact, if the Sufi tafsirs are correct, that people confront the truth of the darkness of the evil that they perpetuated, and I believe they are correct, and that people attain levels of illumination which becomes their state of bliss in the hereafter, none of that is possible in an equation of coercion. Because in coercion, whatever darkness you suffer from, it's not your own. And whatever illumination you have is not your own. In coercion, the first thing you learn is hypocrisy and deceit and to pretend and to dissimulate. Nothing is real. You live in a world of shadows and smoke and mirrors. Remember we said at the beginning that we realize in order for God, there is a God, but in order for God to be moral, you need accountability. But here's the thing. In order for accountability to be moral, you need voluntarism. Accountability cannot make moral sense if there's coercion. It is one thing, since we have a short surah, maybe it's an opportunity for me to say this. It's one thing for me to say, the majority of this population is Muslim. We want to create something that gives expression to our basic Muslim identity. So, we're going to create a state that has basic core Muslim values, as long as voluntarism is the ultimate philosophy. So we don't force people by claiming that we know that the divine will, what the divine will is. Whatever consensus we've achieved, it is our consensus as human beings, but it is not. We don't claim we speak for God. And the more in order for that to be effective, it needs to be a minimalist consensus. Meaning that it cannot the more you take away from the space available for human freedom, for people, then the more coercive the formula. And the more coercive, the far further away you move from the divine ideal. So if you are trying to construct something Islamic, you better try to make sure that it is as less coercive as possible. So it is as coercive as you might need to maintain a rule of law, or as coercive as you might need to maintain a basic Islamic identity. But you have to be careful, because every time you are engaged in the paradigm of the coercive, you know you are taking away from the divine realm. فذكر ما أنت إلا مذكر لست عليهم بمسيطر. Just so you remind, because you're nothing but, your role is to remind. You don't control them. I read this is a Meccan revelation, as a constitutional principle. Because if the Prophet ﷺ was not given license to control a people, then what human being has the right to control a people? I wish Muslims would just reflect on this. All these Muslims that seem to think authoritarianism is okay with Islam and despotism is okay with Islam, and seem to think that, well, Islam, yeah, they completely bought into the Orientalist myth of the Oriental despotism, and they think that despotism is the most natural thing for the Islam. If the Prophet ﷺ, the Prophet, was not given permission to control a people, then who dares say, I have the right to control a people? I mean, does someone like Muhammad bin Salman, does he control the Saudi people or doesn't he? Obviously he does. Someone like Sisi in Egypt, does he control the Egyptian people or doesn't he? If someone tells him, like recently someone just told him that you made a mistake about your negotiations with the Ethiopian government, he was promptly arrested. So anyone, it blows my mind that we don't see a problem with the Orientalist, with the despotic paradigm, which is premised on the idea that a person or a group of people control a population. But if Allah tells the Prophet ﷺ, although the Prophet is aided with direct revelation, you don't have the right to control. So who dares claim that right to themselves? Not of all the theologians of Jami Islam and what's the name of the other? Madkhali Islam and Wahhabi Islam and Sufi Islam and all the zift that's out there. No one responds to this point. No one addresses it. You look at how many Muslim countries live in despotism and you are puzzled by it. If it hasn't been the revealed book, in the Bible it says that you have to obey your king like you obey God. But in the Quran, it is exactly the opposite. So how could it be that Muslims become the one who embody despotism? Anyone that claims to control a people is acting in direct contravention to what Allah said in the Quran. And then they say, "Oh, أطيعوا الله وأطيعوا الرسول وأولي الأمر منكم." It is that doesn't answer this. I mean, we'll get inshallah to this ayah, but it has nothing to do with the way despots control the people, take away their free will, deny them any ability to actually determine their own fate in life, including whether they want to be Muslim or not. Including that. Because if they don't want to be Muslim, who are you to force him to be Muslim? Okay. And then, as to those من تولى وكفر, as to those that turn away, so you have an obligation to remind, but as to those who turn away from you, in other words, don't want to listen, you don't even have an obligation to remind them. So the way that this is translated, over them, but whoever turns away and disbelieves, God will punish them with the greatest punishment. The original Arabic, as to those who turn away means that you don't have an obligation to pursue them, to communicate the message to them if they turn away. They turn away, they turn away. But their affairs, their fate is left up to God. It is God that punishes them. Because ultimately, they will return to us, and accountability is left up to us, meaning to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. I think that's all of Surah Al-Ghashiyah. We should pray Asr. I haven't prayed Asr. I don't think I'll do Surah Al-A'la. Surah Al-Ghashiyah is enough for today.
Okay, Bismillahirrahmanirrahim. So let me start. First, alhamdulillah, thank you for an amazing surah. But as you were just saying, we're going to add your piece to the take. And also, I assume that the dhikr is the entire surah since it's so small or short. I mean, okay.
Bismillah ar-Rahman ar-Rahim. Yeah, I think just the pain has made me forget my own take on Surah Al-Ghashiyah. What I find really interesting is that Al-Ghashiyah, Ghashiyah is understood, as I said, as Yawm al-Qiyamah. Ghashiyah is understood as something that is overwhelming, or whatever is very overwhelming. But there seems to be a third meaning that is rather obvious. And it's surprising that it's not something you encounter in tafsir. And that Ghashiyah is anything that comes from Ghasha, shay. It's the same word that the word Ghish comes from. Ghish means deception. And Ghashiyah is, yeah, I agree that it is probably an allusion to the hereafter. But I also agree that in all these short surah, there is a dual meaning, an allusion to the hereafter, but also an allusion to something in the here now. And Al-Ghashiyah is anything that causes a deception, that is misleading, that is not just misleading, but something that is false and fundamentally a lie. And those who said that al-Ghashiyah refers to hayat al-dunya, and we know that dunya means the lowly life, or the low, the base life. And I think that what they were sensing from that is that, but I understand that attack hadith al-Ghashiyah is, have you reflected upon that deceives human beings, that draws human beings to live into a life of falsehood, and that whatever, whether you are lying to yourself, or whether something like, for instance, a career that makes you think, makes you fundamentally corrupt your values, or I understand al-Ghashiyah, for instance, if there is a career that makes, as often careers that are very lucrative, makes people rebel against their family. They become dissatisfied with their family life. Now I'm earning money, and I'm making money, and I'm living with higher class people, and who, you people are not my, you're lower than me now. And, and then you become very fed up with your family, and you become very dissatisfied with your family. And I see that as hadith al-Ghashiyah, and that's why Allah calls it hadith. It is the news, or the discourse upon falsehood. And that when it does, when you allow yourself to be deceived in that fashion, when you allow yourself to lose who you are, whether, again, it is a form of self-deception or because of the deception that comes from you externally, you become amila nasiba, that you're very busy pursuing whatever you pursue in this life of deception, but your actions are all for vain, nothing. It's literally that amila nasiba. You are very busy. You are pursuing whatever you're pursuing. You think you're achieving things, but you're not achieving anything other than bringing a literal hellfire upon yourself. And the hellfire is the hellfire of the consequences in the hereafter, sure. Because as I said before, that, if I come and I light a fire, and someone comes and tells me, you're lighting this fire, it's going to burn you. And I say, okay, well, when is it going to burn me? And then they say, well, it's going to burn you 10 seconds from now. So in our earthly life, we understand this as, oh, well, you're going to burn yourself with this fire that you've lit. And because it's going to burn me in 10 seconds from now, I might take heed, and I might actually not light the fire. But someone comes and says it's going to burn you an hour from now. Well, okay, most rational people would still not light the fire. Well, someone comes and says it's going to burn you a week from now. It's going to burn you a month from now. It's going to burn you a year from now. It's going to burn you 60 years from now. It's all a matter of timing. Because we're human beings, we think that it's going to burn you 60 years from now but from the perspective of aqeedah, from the perspective of iman, It's going to burn you 60 years from now. It's not a question of whether it's going to burn you. It is going to burn you 60 years from now. So it is as certain as it's going to burn you a second from now. It's going to burn you 10 seconds from now. That's one. But two, for me as a human being, the only reason I start getting doubts about whether it's going to burn me is because of the way I experience time as a human being. But if I experience time outside the human realm, in other words, where time doesn't matter, 60 years from now would be the same as a second from now. It is all a matter of perception. It's not a matter of change in reality. And that's the part that when Allah says, "Tasla naran hamiyah," any deception that is going to degrade you, وجوه يومئذ خاشعة, that's going to deprecate you, will bring hellfire upon you, whether it is a second from now or 60 years from now or 100 years from now. It doesn't matter. It's just a matter of perception. تسقى من عين آنية ليس لهم طعام من ضريع. تسقى من عين آنية is literally you will drink from what you've sowed. If it's understood idiomatically, تسقى من عين آنية, it is not because if you boiling water is boiling water. You can't boil water more than it's boiled. You know, you can't heat water more than its most hot level, because then it turns into gas. So تسقى من عين آنية doesn't make sense to say that, oh, Allah is going to heat up the water and then you're going to drink it. But تسقى من عين آنية means you will drink from the inevitability of the water that you've set in motion. ليس لهم طعام إلا من ضريع لا يسمن ولا يغني من جوع. You will eat the bitterness of the food that you deserve that will not lead you anywhere. You will think you're eating, because you're consuming. But from a point of view of Aqidah, your consumption is actually precisely counterproductive. Because your consumption is not for hunger. You're not consuming what you consume in a fog of deception because you're a hungry person. You're consuming for fun. لا يسمن ولا يغني من جوع, meaning that it will, it's not, you're consuming because of just to have fun. Well, guess what? This consumption will in fact help avail you nothing. All that consumption you've done on earth comes in an instant, and you discover that it's all actually created a huge problem for you. And I think that Ghashiyah, if you reflect on the expression Ghashiyah, is whatever deceives us, whatever takes us into the fogs of self-deception that many, many years ago I talked about before, that, and truly fortunate are those that could confront their fogs and not be deceived by them. That's my main addition to Surah Al-Ghashiyah is, and there's one other thing that I Subhanallah, the Prophet ﷺ used to read Surah Al-A'la, سبح اسم ربك الأعلى, and Surah Al-Ghashiyah in the Eid. And he reportedly would also read he would pray in the Shaf'a and Witr. He would read سبح اسم ربك الأعلى and Surah Al-Ghashiyah in the Shaf'a, and then in witr he would read قل هو الله أحد and المعوذتان. And it is the what is striking for me is that Surah Al-Ghashiyah was it reminded the early Muslims of precisely what I'm saying, is that it would consistently remind them of the need to resist being attracted by deceptive things, by vain things. But more on that, especially the relationship of the Prophet ﷺ to Surah Al-A'la and Al-Ghashiyah, inshallah, when we get to Surah Al-A'la. Since it was revealed first. Surah Sabbih Isma Rabbika Al-A'la was revealed in the early Meccan period, and Ghashiyah was in the middle Meccan period. But interestingly, among the first surah to be taught to people in Medina upon the hijrah of the Muslims to Medina was Surah Al-A'la and Al-Ghashiyah, which is very interesting. Okay.
For those who are interested, what the Sheikh was talking about is a lecture that you can find on our SoundCloud channel called The Fog of Self-Deception. It's a really extremely valuable lecture, and so I would really highly recommend it for anyone who hasn't listened to it. This was from, I believe, the early 2000s, if I'm not mistaken. It was part of a halaqa that you gave. I think, was it part of Shalawiyullah? Or
yeah, it was around that time.
Okay, yeah, so it was the early 2000s. But anyway, that one and also building a partnership with God, those are extremely, extremely valuable for confronting yourself and your fog, like this whole idea of fog and not seeing truth and just kind of the deceptions that you live with. And I think so much of like breaking through that and finding yourself and finding your truth. I mean, that those two lectures were really, really powerful. So anyway, just this was like kind of like throwing in like the most important part, in the Q&A. So alhamdulillah, I had forgotten that Ghashiyah was a word that I associated with those lectures. And we didn't talk about fog in the first part of the halaqah. Yeah. So let me just go around again. Did anybody have any questions here now that we have that kind of new addition? Okay, so, all right, so let's then start with the interactive group. This is from Rizwan. In reference to the discussion on the correlation between internalizing divine attributes and responding to Ghashiyah in this world and elevating in heaven or in the hereafter, two questions. One, is one able to internalize a divine attribute in this world to the extent where they absolutely embody that attribute without any tension of its counter attribute? For example, to be truly grateful and not at all experience inclinations of ingratitude. And second, if one is of the belief that in heaven God takes away the ability to deceive the self from the self and the individual exists in an eternally blissful state, how can one elevate? Elevation presupposes that there are gradations to attributes. However, it does not seem, for example, if one was honest in the eyes of God, that they could become more honest. For there to be gradations, there would have to be some element of negative attributes that lessens one state on the scale of gradations.
Yeah, these are good questions. I'm blanking out.
Okay,
What's the first?
Is it able to? Is one able to internalize a divine
attribute? Oh yeah, okay. So the issue of the internalization on this earth to perfection. Is it possible? It's possible, but it's rare. There are, of course, there are divine attributes that, and that. I mean, it is. I don't want to say easier, but it is possible, for instance, to become the embodiment of mercifulness, and but I think but to become the embodiment of truthfulness and not meet some tension or some resistance or some temptation, that's rare. But anyway, part of the whole the whole discipline of akhlaq is that to talk about the attainment of divine attributes in an order, and usually the way that especially the Sufis would work on it is that they would, depending on the school of Sufism they followed, they would have a certain order within their school of thought that they believed would be more conducive to the ability. So they would start with normally, but with some, because it's very hard to generalize when it comes to all the Sufi tariqas. But normally they would start with attributes that would be more attainable and work towards attributes that are more difficult to attain without resistance. And within Sufi tariqas, they believe that those who actually attained certain levels would become a qutb. And they believe that the qutb would in fact reach that point where they would not have, in most of the theological orientations that were not necessarily wedded to a Sufi tariqah, they did not believe that perfection was possible. So any attribute that you worked on, it was a matter of degree, and you had to keep working on it so you don't slip. And in fact, like in the Usulis, among the Usulis, it was always, we believe that when you think you've attained an attribute to perfection, that's actually when you are at the highest risk of losing it. So they would warn you all the time that when you start getting comfortable with the belief, like, you're not tempted by something anymore, they would always warn you that this is the time that you should be most worried, because you will slip. And a lot of the Usulis who are not Sufis, that was the main skepticism they had was towards a lot of the Sufi tariqas, is that they were always skeptical of claims of attainment. As to the hereafter, it's all premised on the nearness to the epitome of beauty and the epitome of truth and the epitome of luminosity. So it is, how close are you to the divine? And what you are trying to attain in the hereafter is a closer status to the divine. So it is not that it, it is by observing those you are very aware of everything that prevents you from being closer to the beauty of the divine. And some people, depending on their level of their motivation, their awareness, their whatever, some people will be satisfied with whatever status they're in and not strive to be closer. So while others will be driven to ever be closer, regardless of how long it takes or what is involved. And the way that you become closer to the divine is by working on the sifat. But
What is the sifat?
the sifat are the attributes of divinity. But what's interesting is that in earthly life, the way that you work on attributes is by practice, by service of human beings and creation. So the way that you are compassionate is to perform deeds. When it comes to the hereafter, that's really one of the most, that's where you get the most abstractions in thought. Because, and the abstractions get a bit challenging because they don't believe that it is through service anymore that you attain the characteristics of the divine, but through reflection and enlightenment and dhikr, which sometimes gets to sound very philosophical. So if you look up like a tafsir like al-Isharat al-Najmiyyah, most people will read al-Isharat al-Najmiyyah and not understand anything it says. And the reason they don't is because it so much of the language is a specialized language in the realm of these abstractions. You know, I'm not sure how to, because I don't have a frame of reference. I can completely understand that if I, you know, come in the hereafter, and if I'm fortunate enough to be among the blessed, but then I discover that there are 10 veils that separate me from the divine. You know, my heart tells me I will want to wither away these veils to get as closer to the divine as possible. But where it gets hard for me to grasp is that when I'm said, well, you don't wither away these veils through service, which I understand because in the hereafter, what service? But then say through comprehension and understanding, you know, sometimes, you know, I get a glimpse of what is being talked about when I'm reading Ibn Arabi because I see the layers of understanding that he demands. But I hope it's not as difficult as, you know, how good you become in something as abstract like pure mathematics. Because that seems to be very difficult. I hope it's something like dhikr maybe, or, you know, or cleansing away whatever sins that Allah might have forgiven. Allahu Alam, you know, we just don't know. But I accept the idea that whatever barriers exist between me and closeness to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, I will want to wither away. But I also trust that the rules of the game will be clear to me in the hereafter, even if I can't figure them out now.
Sri?
First of all, thank you so much, because this halaqa was among the most profound of them. And I have a question, but I wanted to just make a comment that, having, I think the experience of having a family member that is ill, and I was talking about this with multiple people throughout the day, and it's coincidental. What for me personally was a Ghashiyah. But within it has such immense potential to be a blessing, because it forced me to realize that it shatters your delusions about what life is supposed to be, especially in our society that is very attached to that life is supposed to guarantee comfort, it's supposed to guarantee security, that's somehow a normal thing to expect. And when something like that comes, especially I think early on in a family story, or before old age, it really shatters that, and that becomes a blessing. And whenever I think it's the reason why I'm making this comment is because I think it's important for especially those who might not be as familiar with the Usuli Institute's work to also realize that when we're talking about you in pain, it's not so much about you being in pain, and we're all very grateful for it, but it's also an example of how I feel like it's an example for me of how I'm supposed to my relation to life and my relation to difficulties with life, because pain is a very extreme example of this, but even in lesser degrees, annoyances with people, drama with people, loss of job, loss of relationship, all of these things, I think there's a tendency to look at it and just see the surface of it, but then getting engrossed in the emotions and engrossed in the narrative around it, the lesson is lost and the opportunity is lost to realize how it's actually an opportunity to build a relationship with Allah. And so it's not about the pain, it's not about the difficulty, it's not about the drama, it's about the fact that the response to it is something that can catapult you to Allah, because I think it's a very Christianized idea that suffering for the sake of suffering is somehow divine. But I feel like there's a meaning in suffering, and there's a purpose to suffering, and that's the difference between a westernized, Christianized, Romanized view of suffering and religion, and an Islamic view of suffering and its purpose in our lives. And it's amazing because my question, I'm always, my personal fascination and my personal desire for engaging with your thought and engaging with these halaqas is that I want to understand and I want to help myself and to help other people transform individually. And I feel like the biggest barrier that we have is these deceptions and these fogs. Because we're going against the grain in that we have a very long history of trying to fit Islam within the framework of our society and not investigate our long-held beliefs, you know, whether that be about jobs, whether that be about romantic partners, whether that be about our social groups. You know, we compartmentalize Islam into a certain area. And when we were during this halaqa, I kept reflecting, especially once you gave your interpretation, it kind of brought it around to me, and that's why I was able to develop this question. Is there, where do we draw the line between protecting ourselves and ensuring our rights and doing the beautifully good thing? Because it seems like, I think for a lot of people, there's kind of this idea, which is usually attached to Sufism, that you completely abandon yourself, that you turn yourself like into a punching bag of sorts. But at the same time, I feel like the thing that reinforces my Ghashiyah is this idea of justified resentments, is this idea of protecting myself, is this idea that I have a right to act a certain way, I have a right to be upset, I have a right to have certain standards around materialism, about the people that I choose in my life, or the partners, whether they're friend or romantic or professional. In today's day and age, within the framework of our society and the challenges that we have, how do we draw that line in light of what this surah is asking us to do?
And can you paraphrase that? Drawing the line between.
Drawing the line between protecting the self and doing the beautiful thing. I mean, of course, what Sharif is alluding to is that this often entails a Ghashiyah in many ways, because a lot of people do what's wrong not because they think it's wrong and I'm going to do it, but because they think they have a justified sense of outrage. You know, I am just defending. I mean, and this is, subhanAllah, I mean, after all, you know, look at how much evil Israel has done against Palestinians, and I'm sure that a lot of Israelis believe that they're just defending themselves, but they commit horrible crimes in the names of self-defense, and or what the U.S. did in Iraq, or what the U.S. continues to do in Afghanistan, and continues to do in Iraq, actually. You know, the claim of self-defense is one of the biggest slippery slopes. But you can't ever say that self-defense is wrong, because self-defense is right. But the claim of self-defense will often act as a license for a lot of wrong. And so the question is, not at of course, not at a country level, but at an individual level, effectively, because individuals do what countries do. Individuals commit a lot of things that are wrong in the name of self-defense. You know, righteous outrage. And if you tell them, well, you can't respond to a wrong with a wrong, that in itself becomes a slippery slope because it's not always clear to them what's wrong. If it involves being upset for different reasons that Sharif pointed out, whether relationships or whatever things that people and yeah, I don't think that Sufism require. I mean, I think it is. It is. Cheapened forms of, or cheated forms of true Sufism that tells people to be punching bags. That's not what Sufism teaches either. To be a Sufi doesn't mean that you go around saying, but it is, sometimes a Sufi will allow will reject self-defense as a form of discipline, while having a clear view of what the self is. So there's a big difference between, not defending yourself because you don't think yourself is worth defending, and not defending yourself because you make the conscious decision that I am disciplining myself to avoid certain mistakes, and so I am preferring that I take harm rather than inflict it, or rather than run the possibility of inflicting it, as a form of self-discipline. And I don't think, I think that the Prophet ﷺ, when tells us, make 70 excuses or 73 excuses, or the point is not, obviously, is not to rubber stamp wrongful conduct, but the point is to attain an introspective position before jumping to this notion of righteous outrage. That righteous, or the claim of righteous outrage, the fact of the matter is that so much outrage blinds your eyesight and prevents you from seeing what's right or what's wrong. And so much outrage pushes you into adopting positions that are fundamentally inconsistent with the golden rule of treating other people like you would like to be treated. So, in other words, we are often outraged by things where, if you reverse the tables and it happens to us, and we would be upset if people were outraged at us. So for example, a silly example, but it's real. I've often observed like how people will react to being made to wait. When if they make others wait, they'll often think that, well, I have special circumstances and people should understand the special circumstances. But if they're made to wait, they're often very quick to be outraged and say, what special circumstances? And I think that that's the biggest risk about outreach, is that it is not you don't do rational thinking when you are outraged. And I'm not talking about blind outrage. I'm talking about even being annoyed or irritated. Whenever you are annoyed or irritated, or what is responding is your nervous system, and that nervous system is, there are very few people, or it takes a lot of discipline, a lot of training to get your nervous system to basically abide by a set of pre-worked out principles that are carefully thought out and are morally vetted and ethically scrutinized. A lot of people that claim to have principles or ethics that guide their emotions, they don't. I mean, and they just don't. And if you observe people long enough, you find the amount of contradictions and inconsistencies they fall in is the biggest proof of that. That they'll treat others in the same way that they claimed that, you know, I'm outraged because I have principles and this is against my principles, and then they'll give them enough time. Once you change their positions, and you see that clearly, it's emotions that are dressed up in the form of principles. So, especially if you are in the process of growth, and you know, unless you've done the type of training that where you've gone through, you know, but if you've gone through rigorous training, you also know that the biggest thing is never to accept. It's to be your own harshest judge. That, you know, your conscience is always after you. That's the nature of training. But anyway, is that to always understand that whatever comes out of, ask yourself, but you have to, no one will get a perfect scoring batting average from the beginning. But always ask yourself, you know, is my nervous system excited? And is my nervous system, is what I'm saying to myself is right or wrong? Is it a product of the nervous system, or an intellectual analytical process of thinking about right and wrong? If it's a nervous system, then wait until you calm down. It might take weeks, it might take months, it might take years, but don't judge as long as it is the nervous system, because the nervous system is al-Ghashiyah. It is principles, ethical principles, virtue, requires the contemplation and the deep introspection that comes from ibadah, that comes from dhikr, that comes from philosophical reflection. And it's never aided by an excited nervous system. So, I know that this is hard, but the more you persist in demanding, in you know, catching yourself the better you get at it, and the more you grow. And sooner or later, you'll learn. You know, the thing that nothing excites the nervous system like pain. Like when you are in pain, your nervous system has the patience of an ill child or an ill baby. Your nervous system, can't stand anything. When you're in pain, it just, very active. But if it's possible to train your nervous system to butt out of the adjudicative process, even when you are in pain, then anything is possible. Just work on it. That's the biggest advice I give people, is that if you're just if you're annoyed, if you're irritated, if you're outraged, if you're offended, ask, if you can able to confront yourself and say, it's my nervous system, then throw it out until you calm down and then revisit it.
Alhamdulillah, with that we're out of time. I think it's a good place to stop. Thank you so much, everybody, for being with us, especially you guys who joined us for Eid. Really appreciate you being with us. It's great to see you, and I hope you have a wonderful rest of the evening.
Eid Mubarak.
Eid Mubarak. May Allah bless you for investing your vacation time in knowledge. So I look forward to seeing you on Saturday, inshallah. Have a wonderful rest of the week.
Assalamu alaikum.
Assalamu alaikum. Assalamu alaikum. Thank you.